I'm going to give you an update this morning on flea beetles and what's the best management option for you in canola, since we're seeing really high populations in North Dakota and northwest Minnesota. I'd like to acknowledge my colleague, Pat Bothay, works with me on all my extension and research projects. So as you know, there's two different species of flea beetles that we're now seeing in the canola. There's sort of been a species shift. The most common one is the crucifer flea beetle on your right. This is a small flea beetle, about 2 to 3 millimeters long. It's black, and in the sunlight, it kind of has an iridescent metallic shine to it. And the newer one that we're seeing now on the scene is the striped flea beetle. And as you can see, it has two lines on the wing covers. But they're both very similar in size, and they both have the enlarged hind leg where they hop. And underneath these wing covers, there's a pair of membranous wings. A lot of people think they're not very good flyers, but they actually are really good flyers. Sorry. So just a quick review on the life cycle. There's one generation per year. We'll start right now with the overwintering cycle up at the top there. They're overwintering as adult flea beetles. And then as the temperature warms up in the spring, usually to at least 60 degrees, they start to get active in the overwintering sites, which is the shelter belts and grassy areas. And they're not necessarily, if they're in a field that you have canola, a lot of people think they're just in your shelter belt right next door. Well, they could be there, but they probably aren't. They probably moved much further than that. So they're very mobile. And then once the temperature warms up, the canola starts to get seeded, and then they will mate and lay eggs. The female lays eggs in the soil close to the canola plants that are germinating, and they'll hatch in about 12 days. And then we have about 25 eggs for each female is laid in the soil. And then they turn into larvae that feed on the secondary root hairs. This doesn't usually cause any economic yield loss to the canola. And they feed for about a month, and then they'll go through a pupa stage for about a week, which is a resting stage where it transforms into the adult. And then we get this summer generation that comes out late summer into the fall, and this is the one that gets onto your pods, the canola pods. And then eventually they become the ones that move to the overwintering sites. So they do different types of damage. For the spring generation, they feed on the seedling canola, and you end up with severe reduction in plant stand. And also you get reduced plant vigor because they cause little pits, and then those pits become very numerous when they're in high numbers. That causes defoliation. And then we get delayed maturity, so that could cause problems when you go into swath or harvest, because you'll have all different growth stages present. And then, of course, yield loss. We can get significant yield loss from flea beetles, and we've had several growers this year replanted the whole field, flea beetles. So we rely pretty heavily on our insecticide seed treatments as our key control management option. And you can see that we have 3 different groups. We have the neonicotinoids, or A, and there's 3 different active ingredients listed there. Thiamethoxam, the Helix, Vibrance, clothianidid, the Prosper Everglow, and imidacloprid, gaucho, which isn't used very much anymore. Then the diamines, the group 28, the cyrantonilapro, Fortenza, or Lumiderm. A little bit newer one, and then butanolids, group 4Ds. Buteo just came out this year, so it's brand new. So just a little bit about the newer ones. Lumiderm, it's from Corteva. AgriScience, it's a diamine, the group 28, and it's not like a typical nervous system poison. It works on the muscles, the rhinodine receptors in the insect system. So it's a little bit slower in killing the insect, but it does cause the muscle to contract, and eventually the insect becomes paralyzed and dies. So they quit feeding though right away. And the good thing about this one is it's not only effective against both species of flea beetles, it actually will help you control your cutworms. The company says that gives you about 35 days of protection. However, in the field, we haven't seen that large of a window of protection. So I'll talk a little more about that. And here in Minnesota, North Dakota, we buy it as a premix. That includes the neonicotinoid insecticide, Prosper Everglow, with the Lumiderm. The Lumiderm is usually applied at 9.8 fluid ounces per hundredweight. And you can also get it with the Helix Vibrance. Up in Canada, they use it alone, the Lumiderm, and they have much higher rates that they put onto the canola seed. For Buteo Start, this is from Bayer Crop Science, the butanolids. It's available here as a premix as well, so you don't buy it alone. Prosper Everglow and Buteo Start. And this is good for flea beetles only. As you can see from the picture, it is systemic. So it's translocated from the seed capsule to the roots, and then it moves up into the seedling leaves or the codlins. And you can see it's red, which means higher levels of activity with the active ingredient. So it worked fairly good up to the 4-leaf, but we didn't really see very long residual with this product. But it needs the Prosper Everglow to provide a little more residual. So this is from the Canola Council of Canada. For the foliar sprays that we have available, we use defoliation. So we have 25% is the figure that we use when you need to make a foliar application. If you wait longer than that, you're going to see some yield loss. But one of the important points to make is you need to get that foliar spray on right away. You can't wait a day. I've seen complete fields lost. Checked them out, they were at 25% or higher. They waited a day to spray and they lost it. That's how fast the flea beetles move. They move in large numbers when temperatures are high. And you can get this yourself. just go to the Canola Council of Canada website. One of the things we're noticing with the striped flea beetles is they have a little bit different feeding behavior. And we're noticing that they like to chew on the stems of the plant. And this is not really good news because they can completely chew through that stem, and that will kill the growing point, of course, and then kill the plant. So what do we have for foliar insecticides? We rely heavily on this first group, the pyrethroids, the 3A. Difenthrin is fairly popular, and the lambda-cyhalothrin, the warrior generics, is probably the second most commonly used insecticide. We do have the diamines, pyrantonilpril, elixir, and a couple of premixes available. However, this is going to cost you 3 to 4 times what you pay for a pyrethroid. Very expensive. And then we have, for this premix called Ridgeback, it's bifenthrin and sulfoxaflor. And most of you, if you deal with soybean aphids or grain aphids, you probably recognize sulfoxaflor because it's for piercing, sucking insects only. So the sulfoxaflor will have no activity against flea beetles. It's specifically for aphids, leafhoppers, and piercing, sucking insect pest. And here we have the chlorantonilpril, lambda-cyhalothrin, and besiege. Again, this was very expensive, and you're going to get most of your control with the flea beetle here with the pyrethroid, the warrior, in that premixture. So we really only have one group that we are really using as a foliar product right now for control of flea beetles. So what we wanted to do is take a look at all the different efficacies of these commercially available insecticide seed treatments and see which one is the optimal one for the grower. So we had for our project, we had single active ingredient, the Prosper Everglow and the Helix Vibrant at the standard rate that you get on your seed. And then we had some premixes with 2 active ingredients. We had the Lumiderm. This is the commercial standard. And we also tested Lumiderm with the Helix Vibrance at a higher rate, 14.8 fluid ounces per 100 weight. And then we had the Prosper Everglow and the Lumiderm at the standard rate, and then the high rate and Prosper Everglow and the Beauty will start at the 9.6 and a higher rate, just to see if a higher rate would prove efficacy. And then we had fairly high numbers of flea beetles, so we did have to spray with bifenthrin 12 days after emergence, just to rescue those seed treatments because we wanted to get yield. So we had 60% striped flea beetles and 40% crucifer flea beetles in our plots. And we used a flea beetle rating system of 0, 6, 0 meaning 0 pits in the leaves, and 6 being a dead plant. The threshold is right around in here, 2 to 3, when we usually see that 25% defoliation. So we use this to rate the plants, and we did observations at 3, 7, and 11 days after emergence. And here's the data over on your left is the flea beetle injury rating system, and on the right is the yield and the gold line. And the 3 bars are the 3 different ratings that we did with the injury. So over here is our untreated check, which did have a fungicide on it. And you can see in all of the ratings, it's very high, way up to 5. Number 6 is a dead plant. So, and then here we have the single active ingredients, which generally was fairly similar to where we had all of these are the premixes with 2 active ingredients, so it's pretty similar to these. However, we did notice a difference in the ratings. Sometimes they were a little bit higher. But the main thing I want you to notice is the yield. So here's the untreated check. You can see we had the lowest yield in the untreated check at 1831. And then for the single active ingredients, they were not significantly different from each other, so I just combined them. So they had 21, 23. And then for all the premixes where we had 2 active ingredients, had our higher yield at 24.21 pounds per acre. And here, if you take a look at the line, there's 2 little blips here. And these happen to be Prosper Everglow at 16, will start at 16 fluid ounces, so the high rate, and Helix Vibrance with Lumiderm at 14.8 with the high rate. It wasn't significantly different between the different premixes, but it was the highest. So we wanted to look at the economics, see what the returns were like. So first, we do have a very good relationship between yield and injury rating. Injury rating goes up, yield has a dramatic decline. So here's the economics. Again, I combined them for untreated check, the neonicotinoids alone, single active ingredient, and then where we had the 2 premixes, the active ingredients. So I used just $30 per hundredweight or 30 cents per pound. So this was the average yield we recorded. So here's our yield gain. You can see where we had the premixes, it was twice as high for the yield gain. Then we calculated the crop value and the gain. You can see the gain, again, was twice as high with the premixes compared to the single active ingredient. So here we're just moving down to this next line. Seed treatment costs for the single, $8. For the premix, where we have 2 active ingredients, 16. Then we did the foliar application, that's $10. And then, so we have a negative net gain in the untreated, and then $69 where we had the neonics alone, single active ingredient. We had $150, so it's twice as high in the premixes where we had the 2 different active ingredients. So overall, we had net gain of $81 over the neonics with the premixes. We also did some more work with Buteo Start in 2021. Again, we have both species present, but this time we had a lot more striped flea beetles out in the plots. And again, we had to spray this trial 14 days after emergence, a rescue treatment. and we use bifenthrin at the high rate. So here you can see treatments, 1, 2, and 3. So this is the untreated here. And then treatment 3 is Prosper Everglow alone. And treatment 2 is the Prosper Everglow and Beautyo Start at the low rate. And then treatment 1 is Prosper Everglow and Beautyo Start with the high rate. So you can see the ratings here kind of go up, you know, the more higher rates and lower rating than the low rate of Beautyo Start. And we're both significantly different from the Prosper Everglow alone. But then the flea beetles really moved into the plots in high numbers, so everything was very high severity and damage. So we knew we had to go in and do a spray. So here's the plant population. And again, we saw similar trends, you know, with the highest plant population when the high rate of Beautyo Start, then the low rate of Beautyo Start with Prosper Everglow, then Prosper Everglow alone, and the untreated. And then here's the yield. And again, same sort of trend line. The high rate did the best, and the low rate, and the single active ingredient Prosper Everglow, and untreated check. So it's similar to what we saw in the first study that I showed you. Here's some plots from up in Canada. They had the untreated Prosper Everglow alone, and then Prosper Everglow with the Beautyo at the low rate. And then you can see there's a red line here. Everything below this line was not sprayed with Decis, which is Warrior. Everything above the line was sprayed, and they had 3 different seeding dates: an early seeding date, middle of May, May 20th, and then a late one, May 27th. And you can see the early planting date had less flea beetle damage compared to the late, and the later one also had less flea beetle pressures. You can see it was very severe on May 20th, even with the foliar. That did help a lot, but still not as many plants as you might like to see in those plots. So again, you know, the premixes with the 2 active ingredients seems to work the best. And I also got some data from Dr. Graston at the University of Minnesota at the Canola Production Center there in Roseau. And he took a look at quite a few different treatments, some similar to what we were doing. He had Prosper Everglow Prime, which is just a fungicide, so it's like an untreated check. And he also had Bear Seed here, 8. And he had Prosper Everglow at the standard rate, and Helix Extra Vibrance, just like I did. And then he had Beautyo Start and Fortenza. Fortenza's the same as Lumiderm, remember, with the Prosper. And then he had 3 mixes, 3-way mix with Beautyo Fortenza, and then Helix Vibrance with Fortenza and Lumiderm. Okay, so here's the data. He had 2 different sites. 8 is the untreated check, and 1 is the fungicide alone, untreated check. So 2 is the single, this ones I circled here is the single mode of action 2 and 7. And then here's the combination ones where you had premixes of 2 active ingredients. And number 5 was the 3-way mix. And this is the canola yield. The highest was number 9, which was, I believe, Prosper Everglow plus the Lumiderm. And he did a vigor scale of 1 to 10 instead of the flea beetle rating. He just had overall plant vigor. But again, you can see the premixes, the squares, did a little bit better than the single mode of action ingredient alone. And we didn't really get any benefit from adding a 3-way mix. And then he also did a site where there was a lot more flea beetle pressure. It was very high. And he did have to spray with Warrior at both sites. So you can see again for the yield, our single mode of action, the Helix Vibrance and the Prosper Everglow, pretty much like the untreated check fungicide. Where with the premixes, we had much higher yields, even though we did get up to 3,000, so that's pretty good, considering how many the pressure she was seeing in that field. For untreated check, he had less than 500 pounds per acre. And same trends in the vigor. Again, the single mode of action is comparable to the untreated checks. So in conclusion, we can say that the newer modes of actions were very effective against both species of flea beetle that we're seeing out in the field. And we're going to have to start, scouting the fields frequently because of the high populations of flea beetle. They move around and they will reinfest the fields. And we're not really getting a long enough residual from our insecticide seed treatments anymore. We need to be able to go in and rescue them with a foliar insecticide application on top for additional protection. Because the plant needs to get up and growing until it's at least 6 leaves to be able to tolerate some of the flea beetle feeding pressure. So we also are concerned with crucifer flea beetle and striped flea beetles and their sensitivity to the insecticide seed treatments. So we did some bioassays in the greenhouse with Prosper, Helix, and Lumiderm, and then an untreated check. And these were all used alone. And this is part of my PhD student's work, Leslie's luminol. Okay. So and here's what we found. This is the adjusted mortality from the bioassay. Everything blue is the striped flea beetle, and everything orange is the crucifer flea beetle. And then we have our treatments across the bottom here, untreated check, thiamethoxam, Helix, clothianidid, Prosper Everglow, and cyrantonilapril or Lumiderm. So you can see there's quite a bit of difference here in our trend lines. Striped flea beetles had significantly less mortality from the insecticide seed treatments than the crucifer flea beetle. And all these stars indicate the level of significance. It was all significant. Feeding is the reverse trend. There is a lot less feeding from the injury from the striped. And then the crucifer had a lot more feeding because, sorry, I got it reversed. More feeding from the striped flea beetle and less here from the crucifer flea beetle. So in most cases it was significant except for one clothianidid treatment. So what does this mean? Well, it means that we're seeing a difference in the striped flea beetle, not as susceptible to our insecticide seed treatments as the crucifer flea beetle. And we observed, decreased mortality and increased feeding injury with the striped. And up in Canada, Tansy and all also observed this with the clothianidid and the thiamethoxam between the two species of flea beetles. So what's happening out there is probably a shift to the striped flea beetles. It's survival of the fittest. Who's surviving? The striped flea beetles are. And we just take a look at mortality on 7 to show you difference so you can see some of the data in the table. If I can get this thing to work. Okay, crucifer flea beetle, much higher numbers for mortality. Here's our treatments. And you can just see the difference between that and the striped flea beetle. It's significant. So there is tolerance or resistance going on out there. And Dave also commented that he's starting to see more stripes out there as well as on this seedling. There's 3 stripes and 2 colors. Yeah. On which one? The bioassay? No, I did do a bioassay, but it wasn't in that slide. But Buteo Start, we did a bioassay with crucifer flea beetle and striped flea beetles, and we got comparable mortality. So the striped flea beetle is not sensitive right now to Buteo Start. And then we're also starting to see in cover crops that use radish and turnips, there's a problem when we have large numbers of flea beetles. We're planting this commonly with our rye crop to increase our organic matter. And the flea beetles are going in there and eating completely the radish and the turnips in there. So we're recommending, that you probably don't use cover crops that have radish and turnip in it in flea beetle areas where there's high populations. Select some other mixes. So the take-home message is, we need to be aware of the dominant species out there now. We used to just mainly have the crucifer flea beetle. 20 years ago, we hardly saw the striped. Now the picture's changed, and we're seeing the striped flea beetles more common, and also it may be increasing in number. And then we need to manage both of these species, and they're different in their feeding, and they're different in their sensitivity to the insecticide seed treatments. And when the feeding population is real high, we're seeing the feeding injury extend beyond the time, when the seed treatments are effective. So we're having to go in and rescue them with foliar sprays. What are we using? We're using only one group of insecticide pyrethroids. I'm very concerned about field failures in the future. We may be going out to spray for our flea beetles and we may not get control. If they can develop resistance to neonics, they can develop resistance to pyrethroids. I'm very concerned. This could lead to pyrethroid resistance in our flea beetles, and we don't have another mode of action that is as effective as our pyrethroids. So it's kind of a scary situation. You're probably familiar with the soybean aphid, and the pyrethroid resistance is widespread there in 4 states. And some of the research has shown resistant soybean aphids to pyrethroids are more fit, if you believe it or not. They have increased fitness, meaning they can reproduce more and they can survive better. So not always is resistance, not dominant. So sometimes it seems to carry on and actually make the insect stronger. And then we're also starting to see more pressure on the pod feeding. There is research that has been done with the pod stage, and they use a threshold of 100 to 300 flea beetles per plant from up in Canada, but that was done way back 10 years ago. Now we have different varieties that are shatter resistant, so that work needs to be redone to see if those shatter resistant varieties can tolerate more beetles feeding. And then we're also concerned about the cover crops and they're being wiped out, the radish and turnips in those mixes by the flea beetles in the late summer, fall. But there is some hope at the end of the tunnel. I was involved in reviewing some research up in Canada on flea beetle, and they're focusing now on host plant resistance. And hopefully you can see some of the hairs on this canola variety here, on the stems and the leaves. So they're hoping to bring some of this hairiness, which they've tested, and it is the flea beetles don't like it when it's real hairy, and they don't feed on the hairy plants. So hopefully they're going to be working on bringing these traits over into some newer varieties of canolas. And then also Breakout vilnosa has very waxy leaves, which makes it more difficult for the flea beetles to feed. So maybe down the road, it's going to take time, but we may have some host plant resistance. They're working on identifying markers for breeders to use. They're also looking at natural enemies. There's several ground predators that are good predators of flea beetles, and they're also reworking the threshold to take into account the stem feeding by striped flea beetles.